Alex O'Connor, David Wood, showdown. It happened. They debated. The topic was, did Jesus claim to be God or something like that?
That's the topic, yeah.
The David Wood, Alex O'Connor debate is happening live at the Bless God Summit in Southern California.
But this idea of the divine name being invested into people and them having the authority of God without being Yahweh themselves is, I think, the important ticket here.
Basically saying Jesus was not a good communicator. Jesus seems like the best communicator of all time.
David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude.
Alex seems to think that if you're a human being and you humble yourself in this way, that God can just exalt you to the status of Yahweh.
They want the highest Christology could possibly grant. They need it to be the ultimate Trinitarian. And it's like, bro, like, his name would have already been the greatest name above all names then. Why is it now being rewarded for this act that he had to do in order to get that accomplishment? That theology is just anachronistic, bro. Like, toss it.
There's no way to interpret this as Jesus claiming to be some, just another human being or something like that.
Well, I don't think Jesus is claiming to be just another human being.
Put it this way, you didn't have the Ancient of Days in the picture and you're reading this description, comes in the cloud of heavens, worshipped by all nations. They're obviously God.
Then why would they not just think he was claiming to be the Messiah?
He obviously didn't give them that impression.
When does the two powers in heaven, idea, heresy, if you want to call it that now, when does that begin to emerge?
BC.
The evidence surveyed thus far gives no support for dating the origins of the controversy even to the 2nd century.
You, sir, pop up and ask your Greek question on Philippians.
Because I was there.
You were there, okay.
We got to move to Q&A. We've gone way over the open dialogue.
Apologies,
so if you have a
everybody.
question, line up over there.
I said, I have a question about, and Alex is like, probably. And I'm like, yeah, about the Greek. Yeah, he knew it was coming.
Stephen Nelson from Cross Bible. I have a question about Philippians 2, 6-7.
Is it about the Greek?
And then he said, well, I'd like your opinion on this. But very, very humbled. That was cool.
So I don't know which is the best interpretation. I think you would be a much better person to inform. And in fact, I'd like to know your opinion.
My point was, go to chap. We'll go to the chap. This chap knows Greek.
I spoke to this chap earlier, and you you run a biblical Greek cross-comparison website. So I would love to know what your interpretation of the verse is.
I didn't watch the whole thing. Forgive me, Alex, David. I have not watched the whole thing. I've watched David's opening, at least I'd say 10 minutes of the opening. Keep in mind, I'm like editing a million things, doing so many projects. And then I watched maybe like 5 minutes of Alex's opening. And then I saw clips of later conversations where you, sir, pop up and ask your Greek question on Philippians.
Because I was there.
You were there.
I was
Okay.
there.
I don't want to act like I know, but as we go through this, I'll give my little 2 cents of like where I'm at in my journey on this, trying to wrap my head around the whole Jesus issue. What was the debate like? What was it like in the environment? And how do you think their performances went?
Well, I met Alex before the debate. I didn't meet David. I was there at the Bless God Summit that Ruslan put on, Ruslan KD, it was a 3-day Christian conference. And I was there talking with people about Cross Bible, about my website. And so I jumped on Alex when I saw him because you texted him to let him know I was going to be there. And I had a bone to pick with him because he made that video about Wes Huff where he said that according to Paul, Jesus appeared above 500 brethren, and he suggested that it might be above in a spatial sense.
Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's take a look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, but in the original Greek in which Paul was writing. The word epano means not more than, but over or above or upon. So looking at the Greek, it seems plausible that Jesus did not appear to more than 500 people, but rather he appeared above 500 people. Yes, above. Do you see what I'm getting at? It was a vision in the sky.
He cited Dale Allison. I did some research, and I wanted to just politely correct him, just to say like, hey, just so you know, you made this claim. Some people have been echoing it. I did some research, and I think you need to look into this a little more deeply. He immediately was like, yeah, I actually did a little bit more research into that, and I think I was actually wrong. He didn't even just accept the critique. He jumped ahead of it and said, no, I actually got that wrong. So
I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and a lot of Greek speakers in particular tell me, like, that is interesting, but it's almost certainly being used in the other way. But I just wanted sort of how much stock you place in that consideration.
So I just raised it as a possibility. I didn't regard it as the most likely reading, but there are a couple of Greek texts, ancient old Greek texts that do think of it this way. So yeah, of course it's possible, but on the spectrum, I don't think it's more likely than the other option.
Gotta like that about the guy.
yeah, so he had already figured it out. He didn't need me to tweet at him, even though I tweeted.
Now, let's reverse that and suppose someone like a Christian, and you ask them, like David Wood, hey man, so these appearances, right? These eyewitnesses, I could show you other accounts where they're fictively inventing eyewitnesses.
They would
They
never,
change their mind?
no, they would never flip on that. Yeah.
What?
Well,
I'm teasing.
yeah, there's more weight behind it for a religious conviction where Alex doesn't have religious conviction.
Of course.
Yeah.
So he can move.
Yeah.
This is my point about the problem right out the gate, in my opinion. However, there's so much dogma invested even in Jesus being God. What does that mean? Because this is the thing I don't like about this debate, bro. You ready for this? I'm just going to lay my honest little thoughts here, whether this sounds scholarly or not. I want it to be understood by a general audience. Here's the deal. Jesus is seen divine. Get over it. He is clearly divine in some way. This is the unfortunate part about engaging someone like David Wood or IP or any of the apologists on this topic, because you're already forfeiting a shit ton of ground, and you have to be very complex and nuanced in explaining why it's not this full-on trinity that has been totally packaged together to make sense of everything. You're already forfeiting so much ground that he is divine. Like, both guys should just go, yeah, he's divine. Now we're really quarreling over, like, how close to the Father, how equal to his dad in heaven is he? Is he really one and the same, or are they really distinct? Oh, well, they're both. And then notice, like, all of the complexities of trying to explain and make sense of something that doesn't make sense, that isn't meant to be a rational, easily acceptable idea. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, one thing that I think wasn't really put out there in the beginning of the debate is what exactly Alex was conceding to off the bat. So he did not say, if I recall, just so we establish this, I am arguing that according to the depiction in the Gospels, Jesus claimed to be God, right? That he did not claim to be God. He's basically granting the veracity and the univocality of the four Gospels in depicting Jesus as having this perspective on equal terms.
It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the Gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself.
Without getting into the details of whether or not Mark's Jesus is more accurate than Luke's Jesus or John's Jesus,
Right.
Whether or not there are any differences between those perspectives and those depictions of Jesus. So that, I think there was some nuance that went out the window there, because we just don't really know what, because we know that Alex doesn't believe in any of that stuff.
Of course, I don't either, but that's why I think it's easy for me to be flexible on a text, a story, to be very frank. And if we grant authenticity, as we were talking about with Paul's letters, then a really cultic setting with already a formalized type of theology about this guy, who's divine. In Paul's eyes, he is divine. He was made divine. He was already in the image of God, comes down, but then his name was not above every name until after he dies.
So that's another issue, is that that's Paul's perspective, and you have to kind of import Paul's perspective into the Gospels in their depiction of Jesus claiming to be God, in his own words. And I think that there were some lines that were blurred in that debate, because if that was the topic, Paul really shouldn't be admissible, right? We shouldn't be talking about the Christ hymn in Philippians 2, but they did talk about it in Philippians 2. And this was the question that I brought in the Q&A. I think I was like after God Logic or somewhere. I was in between some YouTubers. And what I noticed is that I think the first person to mention it was, I don't remember actually. I think it was Alex who first mentioned it.
And his friends got the message. How do his friends react? What do the early Christians say? In Philippians 2, Paul quotes an early Christian song or poem or creed about Jesus. It goes like this: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness.
If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking of Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know.
So Alex used a pretty run-of-the-mill translation to say that God, when he existed in a divine form, or when Jesus existed in the form of God, or when he was in the form of God, which is a very literal translation of the Greek, right? It's en morphetheu, right? In the form of God, or in a God form, right? And so in that form, he did not perceive or did not regard he did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. And it uses the Greek word arpagmos, which literally means seizure. Like it means grabbing something, like grabbing onto, for dear life. And the arguments that happen in the scholarship among Christian scholars usually is just like, okay, if he didn't think he needed to grasp equality with God, is it because he was already equal with God? Because he is God? Right? He doesn't need to grasp equality with God because he already has it. So there's no,
Right.
he doesn't regard it as something that he needs to steal, as he already has it.
But that's anachronistic because we're dealing with a time before we have settled creeds and settled established ideas about.
Yeah, the problem is that the language of the Christ hymn in Philippians can go in different directions. It's like,
Well, that's why we didn't even talk about Adam, how James Tabor and others kind of bring in this idea.
Yeah.
And I even see hints of this idea thinking of Paul's Adamic theology in 1 Corinthians, right, and other places. If you grant that he has Adam in mind in some way, Adam failed. Adam did try to have equality with God.
Yes.
He did reach and grasp, if you will. It doesn't mention a fruit here in context. I'm just making a point.
So Alex cited Dunn's work on this and his theory about the Adamic, wanting equality with God.
James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God. If we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems, Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized, not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted.
Alex's position, which he admitted when in the Q&A when I asked my question, and you could play it, he said that I'm just sort of articulating Dunn's position. I don't know if it's correct, but this is just what I presented. That maybe being in the form of God is similar to Adam's being in the image of God. Now, the word image also appears in the hymn somewhere. I don't remember exactly how, but it's ikon, right? So ikon, like icon. That's where we get our word icon, right? So ikon is the image of God, and that is the image that Adam was made in. In other words, Adam looks like God, right? And so the question is the word morphe in this context synonymous with ikon? Is your morphe, right, the same as your icon, right? Like,
Right.
is it an outer appearance? So basically, he's in his divine form, and then he sort of takes on the form of a human, but he's still God, right? Or is it the essence or the nature? So basically, Alex says that according to Dunn, Jesus is in the form of God, and then he takes on the form of a servant. and that is the Adamic theology where he basically, it's just saying he looks like God. It's an outer appearance. He's not really God, according to Dunn.
The context in which I think I brought that up, unless I'm misremembering, is James Dunn's interpretation of the passage. So I suppose I'm trying to make that passage make sense in light of my view. It could be wrong. It could be the wrong idea. It could mean existing in the form of God in the sense of being like an exalted being, exalted to the level of God. That might be the case. I don't exactly have a preference. To me, the question of Paul's Christology is secondary to the question of Jesus claiming to be God. Of course, it is interesting why Paul might have a high Christology, or that itself is, of course, debated. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore, but I'm happy for the sake of argument to just grant that Paul had a high Christology.
The whole idea of grasping equality with God is like what Adam did, and it's like an analogy, and then James Tabor argues the same thing. It doesn't account for the two different words. It doesn't account for the fact that
unless you synonymize, make them same.
Unless you claim that they are the same, but they're used differently, right? So I don't think they're the same. I don't.
You think this is a pre-incarnate divine Jesus, and then he becomes man, mortal, he humbles himself to death.
Yeah.
Then, so this is the thing we have to wrestle with. It would, to me, the hymn wouldn't make any sense. I know people want to bring the creeds in. They want to bring their fully Trinitarian view.
Yeah.
Like, there had to be a time, according to this hymn, where Jesus, the Christ, was not name above every name. He was less. He was not as important as he is now by his death. So they want the highest Christology you could possibly grant. They need it to be the ultimate Trinitarian. And it's like, bro, like, his name would have already been the greatest name above all names then. Why is it now being rewarded for this act that he had to do in order to get that accomplishment? That theology is just anachronistic, bro. Like, toss it. He had to be somehow subordinate in some way, shape, or form, then granted something he didn't already have. Like, they want the full on, and it's like, bro, you got to take a piece at a time. So he may have been divine, pre-existent, came down in the flesh, went, unlike Adam, faced death and ended up being rewarded, name above all names, and by which everyone is saved. Okay, that's still not the full-blown picture they want to give you, it seems.
When I asked my question, I pulled up, I had this on my phone ready to go, right? And this is Cross Bible, and you're not going to maybe be able to see it, but basically I have Philippians 2:6 pulled up.
Yeah.
I have the NIV on top. I have the NASB in the middle, and I have the Greek on the bottom, right? So like, this is what my site does really well, and it works pretty well on the mobile phone too, where you can have three versions just side by side, line them up, and you can share the link with people. So I had it pulled up in the Q&A, and the thing that I pointed out is that going by the NASB, you get what Alex was presenting, that Jesus was in the form of God, and that's pretty literal.
Mm-hmm.
But the NIV does something different, and this is what David Wood quoted. So they were both quoting the same passage, which probably wasn't even admissible anyway, because it's Paul's perspective. It's not what Jesus said about himself in the Gospels. So I don't even know why they were going there, but they went there. He uses the NIV translation, which says, "Who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage." But what does that sound like? That translation, compare that to the NASB. "Who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped." It's very different.
It does sound different.
You use different translations of the Greek word morphe. So on one side, we have the translation of form, and on the other side, we have the translation of nature. Now, nature is coming from the NIV, "who being in very nature God," and then take the NASB for morphe, "who as he already existed in the form of God," and morphe theou, and then he takes on the form of a servant, morphe doulou. So can you guys justify why you prefer those specific translations that you used of the Greek word morphe in the Christ hymn in Philippians 2?
Going back to the NIV, it just sounds like he is ultimately God.
Yeah.
Whereas the other one sounds like there's an option there to kind of try and reach and to grasp. And don't we get, in a weird way, I'm sorry, I'm rabbit trailing here, but like, there are these texts, even in Jewish literature, in Ezekiel, where one thought they could be above God. They thought that they could, rise above the mountain of God. They thought that they
Hubris.
Yeah. And so this is a humbling reversal of that divine king And rather than rising above God, he decides to take the humble route.
I approached Alex before the debate, commented on his Greek. He realized, okay, this chap knows Greek. Then when I approached the microphone, he immediately, I said, I have a question about, and Alex is like, about the Greek. And I'm like, yeah, about the Greek. Yeah, he knew it was coming.
Stephen Nelson from Cross Bible. I have a question about Philippians 2, 6 through 7.
Is it about the Greek?
And then he said, well, I'd like your opinion on this, which very humbled. That was cool.
So I don't know which is the best interpretation. I think you would be a much better person to inform. And in fact, I'd like to know your opinion.
And my point was,
We called you chap.
He called me the chap. This chap knows Greek.
I spoke to this chap earlier, and you you run a biblical Greek cross comparison website. So I would love to know what your interpretation of the verses.
And then so the point that I made was that you have to move past verse 6 and get past the idea of, okay, the NIV says that he was in very nature God, right? So that means that they're translating the word morphe as nature, which means it's his inner essence. It's not the outer appearance, it's the inner.
Mm-hmm.
NASB is saying he's existing in the form of God, which seems like an outer appearance, right? So they're the exact opposite. These two translations, at least into an English speaker's mind, are the opposite. Then in verse 7, the NIV says, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness.
Right.
So it's going from being in very nature God, like internal, to making himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, internal, being made in human likeness. Now, so this is the sort of the conflict that the NIV runs into, where the NASB is a lot more straightforward, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men. So basically, he transformed. It was transfiguration, right? Like the transfiguration is metamorphosis in Greek.
Right.
It's the changing of form.
Okay.
Which is a big theme. It's a big theme, right?
Yeah, this is an important point you're bringing up here, because it does correlate to the Gospels. You kind of have to see that Pauline ideas here or gospel ideas are permeating into Paul. That's that whole other question. But here's the point. We'll just go with the standard model. Either way, it doesn't matter. Because when you're looking at I call it epiphany, it's an epiphany where a divine figure is showing their true essence. I do think Mark is implying that with him transfiguring. This is not just a Moses face shine because God is like trying to illuminate. This is beyond that. This dude is divine on a mountain. And you get this. I found this in the hymn to Demeter. I found this in Homer, like over and over and over. Figures hide who their true identity is. It's a well-known mythic theme for those who might be watching who are Christian, who are tuning in. You may not realize this. It's a very interesting observation. Go look at the Greek literature long before they did this. Demeter hides her identity to a woman who she's going to like build up this person. I can't remember what the reason is. This like young girl. And the mom ends up like putting in the fire. I can't remember the exact details of the story, but Demeter's pissed because she was going to make that girl divine, like build her to become God or a god. And at a moment, then she transformed from an old woman into a beautiful, glowing, beaming, bright goddess. And then she knew.
That's her true form.
That's her true form.
Yeah.
This is Jesus' true form, trying to show not in very nature, in the form of God. He is a form of a divinity. He is there with his Father. He is definitely connected. And then it gets weirder when we get to John, because, and this is something Alex said that I thought was interesting in the debate. He's like, well, when he talks about, may I be in you, Lord, as you are in me, or Father, as you are in me, and that we are in them, that they are in us, you're not talking about other divinities, other people who are going to participate in the form of God, okay? Christians don't like to do that. They don't like making, I mean, there are some. Eastern Orthodox have a kind of way that they allow you to become divinized in some sense, but like, do you see where I'm going with this? Like, John's opening that door for you can also become divine in this sense. Not just, oh, I became immortal, but
David Wood's response to my question, because I asked it to both of them, why are you picking these translations in particular? Yes, they're different. And Alex's response was, well, I'm just picking a translation that aligns with Dunn. I'm presenting Dunn. I'm not really committed. I'd rather, what do you have to say about it? He was very non-committal.
The context in which I think I brought that up, unless I'm misremembering, is James Dunn's interpretation of the passage. So I suppose I'm trying to make that passage make sense in light of my view. It could be wrong. It could be the wrong idea. It could mean existing in the form of God in the sense of being like an exalted being, exalted to the level of God. That might be the case. I don't exactly have a preference. To me, the question of Paul's Christology is secondary to the question of Jesus claiming to be God. Of course, it is interesting why Paul might have a high Christology, or that itself is, of course, debated. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore, but I'm happy for the sake of argument to just grant that Paul had a high Christology.
And David Wood said, well, in my view, the morphe does mean, I say morphe, he says morphe, it does mean something like form or shape. So it is an externality. But he said, but I think when you take that shape, or when you take that form, you are changing your very nature. So he said, if I change into the form of that dude over there, then my nature is changing.
Yeah, I mean, the morphe would, the most obvious translation would be like form or shape or something like that. What the NIV writers are doing is saying, if someone's in the form of God, what do you say? If I say he was in the form of God, then this happened. Sounds like you're saying somehow in nature God. And so that's their that's the interpretation. I think that's good, so I'm fine. I think that's the meaning, and therefore the NIV frequently translates according to the meaning and not like a literal definition. But if someone's in the form of God, I think it makes sense to say in nature God. What doesn't make sense is what Dunn does is he takes it as like this means the image of God, and it just doesn't make sense with the rest of the passage.
Something that is worth pointing out, I suppose, is that the same word morphe is used in the long ending of Mark, where Jesus appears in a different form to two of them. So if morphe is supposed to mean sort of essence, as in the morphe of God meaning like having the same sort of essence as God, if that's what it's supposed to mean, then it's unclear why the writers of the long ending of Mark would say that he appeared to two other people in a different morphe. It seems to maybe imply something.
No, that makes perfect sense. If I say someone changes appearance or something like that, then that makes perfect sense. If I say someone is in the form of God, what could that possibly mean? What does it mean to be in the form of God? That's what they're saying. What does it mean to be in the form of God? You have to be, there's got to be something. There's got to be something about being in nature God.
Yeah.
What else is in the form of God? I can understand what, if I could change my form, I know what it would mean to change into the form of that guy.
Yeah, well, of course,
I don't know what it would be to change in the form of God.
If Dunn's interpretation is correct, which I don't know if it is, but I think it's an interesting one to consider, then morphe in that context is talking about being made in the image of God. And so to be in the form of God means to be made in the image of God. And so to appear to someone in a different form means to look different, perhaps. It seems perfectly consistent, in other words. I don't think
it just makes no sense, because that's before he makes himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant being made in human
Yeah, that's the problem. I think that's the problem with Dunn's interpretation here, but it's not a problem with the word morphe, which we can discuss that if you like.
That was it was an off the cuff response. I don't think he really thought through why. I mean, actually, no. I do think. Let me put it this way. I think that it was advantageous for Alex to use a more literal translation that translates morphe as form. And it was more advantageous to David Wood's position to use a hyper-evangelical conservative translation like the NIV that says he was God in his very nature.
And that he literally said, which there's a few points I did watch in the debate where he literally said, well, NIV usually tries to cut the fluff and tell you what it means. So they're doing an interpretation when they're translating it. They're already interpreting it the way that they see it means.
Because Greek has a word, thesi, for nature. So it's like if the creed wanted to say, or Paul wanted to say, in very nature God, he could say like en thesi, like there is a way to say that in Greek, but he's not. He's saying en morphe, he's saying in the form, right? Because
does this not touch, even if you don't take Dunn's view, does this not tap into the Adamic stuff and the whole, that divine? I'm not saying they had the same idea in mind because we're in a Hellenistic setting, but the divine man who thinks he'll rise above God. I mean, you do get this.
Well, maybe he's the antithesis of the Satan. too, like the fallen angel who
Right.
was seeking equality with God.
I think there could be something to that. The idea of them dealing with the archons and stuff, and this idea that Jesus is engaging with Caesars. I mean, part of me does wonder if there is a jab at Caesars being gods, because look at Revelation. The Apocalypse of John is all about this. They set themselves up in the temple of God to be worshipped as God. They're clearly demonic in some sense, and you kind of wonder, is here are these apotheosized, divinized men who have all this fame and glory they're aiming for, and he's just taking the servant route and suffers to his death, taking the opposite route of, I'm going to do this for vanity. This is for humble sake. My philosophy is different. That gets into a whole nother thing, but your question was a really good one. They didn't get into the later stuff you were pointing out about how to, because if you actually get into that, it actually works against the very nature God. And again, just getting to the conclusion, he's the very nature God, but he's getting rewarded. Wouldn't you imagine if God is God and immutable and perfect and unchangeable and all that kind of stuff, and he is one with his Father, and that he doesn't need to go through all this. He's name above is already name above all names.
Well, Alex pointed out that the word arpagmos can mean something like a violent seizure, right? Like a robbery. Like he did not regard it as robbery. I think that may even be the King James translation, if I'm remembering correctly. That's a literal translation.
That word grasped there, harpagmon or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it. He's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names.
The issue is that there are two nouns in Greek. One is arpagi, which is like it's like rape, right? Like the arpagitis Helenis is like the rape of Helena, right? Like when someone is captured and against their will, that is arpagi. Arpagmos they come from the verb arpazo, which means to grab, right, or to seize, and that is a verbal noun. So it just basically means he didn't regard he didn't regard the action of seizure or the action of grabbing as worthwhile. He didn't regard it as it's the language is so difficult, and also because he's in the form of God and therefore didn't regard equality with God as something to be grasped. The word God is in both places.
So let me ask you this about that interpretation based on your observations. Scratch the evangelical view here, or the Christian view that's been typical. Here you have it's saying in the text right there, he's in the form of God, but didn't think equality to be grasped with God, like to grasp equality with God. How that doesn't add up if very nature God, but didn't think equality to grasp the very nature of God. I mean, I'm just making, how do you interpret this without needing to use the typical evangelical understanding?
I mean, the answer is I don't know how to properly interpret it. Like, I don't have a really, really strong position on it because I see both sides. And I know both sides have evangelical and, presuppositional biases here of they think they approach the text already believing in the Trinity. So they have to view it through a Trinitarian lens. But, do you view Philo through a Trinitarian lens? Because he has the divine logos. That is also that is the agent of creation. It is the word or the reason that is articulated by God to basically speak everything into existence, right? And that is Jesus's role as this sort of archangelic figure. Is that what's going on in the Christ hymn in Philippians, where God is that logos? Does it overlap with John? Can John inform it, or vice versa?
Right.
Because John also has a hotly debated topic where he says, and the word was divine, right? And the word was theos, right? Because it's theosinologos. He puts the word God in the front of the sentence. And there's a really fundamental interpretive challenge there, because when we render it into English, we have to put God at the end.
Right.
We can't, we are slaves to our English grammar,
Of course.
in our word order, and we have to say the word was God. And the only solution that, like, people like Dan McClellan has made a lot of content on this recently, he's arguing that it's the word was divine, because it is it is a predicate nominative is the fancy term for it, right? It's the word God is being used, even though it's a noun, it's being used like an adjective to modify logos, to say logos was God, God was logos, but it implies that the logos was a divine being. And that's what we also have in the Philippians hymn. And none of this really ties back into any of the stuff they were debating, which was basically David Wood's position was the two powers in heaven theology that was persistent in early rabbinic Judaism, that Alex O'Connor said was a heresy. He said that this is basically there are these two powers in heaven. There's the kind of God that you can be around, who's a physical manifestation on earth that people can interact with, and there's the kind of God you can't be around. And Jesus was claiming to be one of those two deities, and the Holy Spirit kind of fits in, but not really.
The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. And then Jesus came along. And he says, in effect, you know those two powers that you've been reading about in the scriptures? You know those two powers that you're so confused by? I can tell you about those two powers because I'm one of them. The Son of Man, that's Jesus' favorite title for himself, will be seated at the right hand of power. So there's the power, which sounds like God, and there's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. How many powers in heaven? I see two here, and Jesus claims to be one of them.
Right. And so that was his position, that was in a nutshell. His position was just this. He was pressing the two powers in heaven theory and tying it to the Gospels, even though the Gospels don't actually explicitly say it. He was arguing that they implicitly say it. Whereas Alex O'Connor's position was basically kind of the sort of default position in scholarship, which was just that the divine name and the divine powers and ordinances, like this was all assigned to Jesus, who was an appointee, and to bear the divine name, to bear these divine powers, even though he was not equal to, or he wasn't synonymous with, or the same person as Yahweh. He was appointed to represent Yahweh on earth. That was Alex's position in my paraphrase.
But this idea of the divine name being invested into people and them having the authority of God without being Yahweh themselves is, I think, the important ticket here. When every knee will bow to Jesus, what is the context? Jesus has been given the name that is above all other names. Given it.
And all of the rebuttals from David Wood were focused around, okay, so you think Jesus was some dude. And then Alex would have to say, no, I am not saying that I think Jesus was just some dude.
Right.
I think I think Jesus was indicating that he was like the Son of Man figure, that he was this like really, really highly appointed emissary of God on earth, that he was a very, very, very special dude, not just some dude.
Yeah.
And that was the back and forth. It's like, you think he's just some dude. No, I think he's really, really special. And it's they kind of talk past each other in those points.
That's unfortunate because when you look, I mean, again, the title, what did Jesus claim to be God? What a messy situation you're in when you have someone who's already coming at it with a Trinitarian goggles. You're having someone who's trying to approach this with a standard scholarly view. To me, I mean, you do get these little things that jump out at you that he's more than a man, right? Clearly throughout the gospel. And so you get the standard model that like my friend James McGrath and others might try to do is he's a very heightened man who is made divine by his death, which you get this in Paul. Like you get kind of this idea in Romans 1. Exalted, right? But you get these epiphany scenes that he's divinized in some way. And did that only happen at the baptism, right? This is a question in Mark, because Matthew and Luke, they solve this. They go an extra mile to go, dude was born by God. Get over it, okay? what do you say? He's half human, half God. Technically, you could just say he's divine, mortal, okay, demigod. And they really fix that problem. But when you get into Mark, it's so weird. Like this, here he is getting baptized, and that he's adopted. He's become, you are my beloved son. Like an adoption is taking place right there, and you get the early adoptionist. And so I just find it ironic that all this material, you had various sects of early Christianity who are literally doing the very thing today Alex and David Wood are doing. And one is going, no, he did not claim to be God at all. Okay. And then the other one's like, no, he was full on God. He was full on equal all the way. And like,
Well, all of this really hinges on the book of Daniel, right? Because in my view, Daniel is the cornerstone of the entire Bible, right? It's sort of like that uniting factor of the New and Old Testament in at least in Christianity. That's why I named my son Daniel. And that's why very early on in our interactions, I was like insistent, you have to get John Collins on
yes,
MythVision. This was before there was like a ton of John Collins content on YouTube.
yes.
And I was pouring through his commentary on Daniel, and you had when you reached out to him, and I'd take some credit for that.
Of course.
Driving, yeah,
It really did though.
And so, and then you booked him, and you're like, I have to read this whole commentary, and I gave you the Cliff's Notes of like, these are the questions you need to ask John Collins, and a lot of it was focused on that Son of Man figure in Daniel 7.
You have a high god named Ale, who is a white-headed ancient figure. And you have a young god who is the rider of the clouds, Baal. Now, Baal gets a bad reputation in the Hebrew Bible, but for people in that part of the world, Baal was the god who brought the rain. Baal was the god of life. But now, you see, in a Jewish context, then this seems anomalous because suddenly you have two divine figures. Everywhere else you hear of a figure riding on the clouds of the Hebrew Bible, it turns out to be Yahweh, the God of Israel. Here, it can't be Yahweh, yet that job is already taken. That's the Ancient of Days. So, who is it? And this, I think, you see, this is also a new development really in this period. Because before this period, you don't have any angels known by name, and you don't have an angel who is the designated prince of Israel, like the patron angel of Israel. But that's what Michael is here. And so this is why I think it is Michael. Now, I mean, they're still hoping for the deliverance of the Jewish people. But it makes a big difference whether you just think, put it in those terms and say you're hoping for the deliverance of the Jewish people. Or if you think that you are hoping that the archangel Michael will defeat the beast that has come up out of the sea. Because if you put it the latter way, what it shows is you think there's a lot more going on. That it's not just Jews against Greeks, that this is a cosmic struggle. So that's what's going on.
And as he approaches the Ancient of Days, and they're clearly like the author is portraying them as two different beings, but then people freak out when Jesus claims to be, the Son of Man you're gonna see him coming on the clouds. And that was another crux of the debate, was like, David Wood was saying that the reason the Pharisees, or the reason that people wanted to crucify Jesus after saying he was the Son of Man is because that was a claim to be divine. And Alex was like, no, it's not. It's just a claim to be the Son of Man figure. The Son of Man is not Yahweh. He's approaching the Ancient of Days. He's not the Ancient of Days. They're not the same person.
Right.
And there's different theologies there. And I don't know what was the core Christian theology in the relationship, interpreting the relationship between the Son of Man that would come on the clouds and the Ancient of Days, and Jesus's role as the Son of Man.
Yeah, because what these Christians like David Wood will do is they will find examples where Yahweh comes on clouds, and then they
that was exactly his argument.
They just go, well, Yahweh came on clouds many times, and therefore he's claiming to be Yahweh. Or they love to go to a text where Mark is quoting something and say, notice that it's Yahweh here, therefore gospel means Jesus is Yahweh. And they do this a lot, right? They kind of they don't see it as like a recontextualization or something to say this is a very important person. It's his son, clearly, who is the representative of his father. They want father, son equal, identical, not as persons, but identical in essence. And it's like, oh my God, here we go. So
Yeah.
how do you debunk that? I mean,
Well, because also the thing that Alex really pinned David down on was like, okay, if you believe that the reason they wanted to crucify Jesus is because he claimed to be the Son of Man, that necessarily entails that they believed, like the Pharisees believed, that the Son of Man was Yahweh.
right.
Do you believe that they believe that? And David would really wiggle and just be like, I think that's a reasonable interpretation because Yahweh's the one who comes on the clouds. So the Son of Man coming on the clouds means that he's Yahweh.
Right.
And Alex kept pushing back on, like, in the discussion before the Q&A, saying, so you believe that they believed that in the first century, that this was already the interpretation of Daniel 7.
Right.
And he would not concede that. He just wanted to make it clear that, like, that he believes that that's the reason, because that is the contemporary Christian interpretation. That's the run-of-the-mill, that is the Orthodox interpretation.
It sounds like it's talking about Yahweh when the Ancient of Days is Yahweh. That's it. So you come up, you try to explain it in other ways. Could this be the Messiah? It just doesn't fit. Could this be the nation of Israel? It doesn't fit. There are all these interpretations, but
that
it's clear if a guy says you will see the Son of Man coming with at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Yeah, it doesn't seem like they were taking that to just be a claim to be the Messiah.
That interpretation, and you're right that I'm bolstering the case here that Jesus must have been claiming to be Yahweh. What I'm saying is that if your position is correct, and that is the only thing that he could have been accused of blasphemy for, then you have to presuppose that the high priest had that interpretation of Daniel 7, which just seems so implausible to me, that that's what they thought Daniel 7 meant. So that's what they thought at that time that it meant, that this Son of Man, who they did expect to come, would be Yahweh himself. Is that what you think they thought? Because you have to, for this to run.
I think James McGrath told me that interpretation of why they thought it was blasphemy wasn't that Jesus was claiming to be God, is that they thought he claimed to be Son of Man, which was a very high authority, and his understanding of his relationship with God was blasphemous. That they weren't saying, oh, you're claiming you are Yahweh, kill him, blasphemy, right? That he thinks that they're interpreting it as like, this is offensive. This is blasphemous to our deity, that you claim to have a special relationship to him, that you're the special Son of Man approaching, this kind of thing. So notice that, like, who's right and who's wrong? Like, how do you know? You can't know either way in this view. My personal opinion, you're reading it, I could see why either side might struggle here and go, well, I think he thinks he's God and he's claiming to be God and they're going to try and kill him.
Well, there's also the conflation of, okay, if he claims to be the Messiah, if he's making Christological claims, that means he's claiming to be God. But then you have to import the idea that Jews thought the Messiah was God, right? Like they
didn't,
or even Son of God,
as far as I'm aware of. I do know that in Enochian literature, there's a strange thing in the similitudes where at the end of it, Enoch is dealing with, all of the celestial journeys, seeing the fall of man. He's kind of getting hints that the end's coming. He's seeing justice needs to be done. And in the end, he approaches the Ancient of Days. I think he calls him Ancient of Days in Danielic language. Or Enoch has a strange way of using this term that isn't found in our typical language to describe God. And his flesh melts away. He's transformed into a luminous figure, and that he is then identified with this Son of Man, and that it was Enoch who is a Son of Man. But he's still in that context in the Enochian literature, separate from the ancient one, the ancient deity that he is then somehow very closely related to, but not the very same. It's just odd to me, because I like to look at analogous other examples too, not just Jewish stuff, and I go, what is the relationship between Dionysus and Zeus? He is Zeus on earth in a way. He's his father on earth in many ways. Yet he's not Zeus. He's not identical to Zeus in that sense. But there is Orphic material that says Dionysus and Zeus are like one and the same in a way. There's Orphic material later that kind of tries to correlate them in this similar fashion.
Well, maybe that is part of the reason why Paul's gospel caught on so well among the Gentiles and was not accepted by the Jews, because the Gentiles in that day, coming from that polytheistic background, had the model already, first of all, of a monotheistic philosophical one deity, even though it could have multiplicity of forms and manifestations, and then also just the idea that a deity could exist in a dyad or a triad, which was a trinity, right? The trias is the triada. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
So basically, like, that idea was already brewed and ready to go in paganism.
Yeah.
So that when Christianity came, it was like, oh yeah, this is a different form of what we already believe. And it's this Jewish God, and this Jewish God is like better than our gods, and we're going to go ahead and convert. And for the Second Temple Jews, that was probably a hard pill to swallow.
Probably. I mean, like you said, it's a very Hellenistic kind of spin-off of this. The other interesting thing is, I'm thinking of M. David Litwa's book, Late Revelations, I think it's called. This one is it's like a recent book. He talks about a model, I can't remember what he calls it, of the Gospels, where he thinks maybe there's a scribe somewhere in the early 70s, 80s on Mark, but he does this with each gospel that they get later and later. But then he says there's evidence he sees in the Gospels that hints at a post-Bar Kokhba touch-up, or they're aware of something post-Bar Kokhba. And
in all four Gospels?
I don't know if all four, but it seemed like he implied that there is this, like these texts are being touched, and there's implications that historically there's nowhere in the 70 AD war with the Jews this could not fit. It could only fit in Bar Kokhba. And it's not just John's gospel, which we've heard before, hints at that. We're talking Mark even, like things in there. You'd have to read the book, and he gets into the Greek and why, all that. You're going to love it. The thing is this, he, in that book, in Matthew, at the end of Matthew, when it says, now go, Great Commission, baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Even Litwa in his book was like, this is the Trinity.
Yeah.
So Matthew is already positing a Trinity in his view. Well, I mean, again, for me, I have no, it wouldn't bother me one bit if you wanted to say there's 9 of them, I don't care. It doesn't matter how many. It doesn't matter if you think he's equal to God or in some way, shape, or form has such a special relationship that he is equal to God. It doesn't matter to me. But when we're looking at these texts, we got problems. There's all sorts of different difficulties to jump through hoops to try and explain, and why early Christian groups ran with different understandings of this divinity and how to understand Christ, how to understand. There's reasons they didn't all line up with the Trinity. There's a reason they're looking at the same material, coming out away with it with a different understanding from this material, because it's not univocal either. That's another problem. So how do we make sense of it? And I just find that fascinating. So overall, your personal opinion of the debate. Alex, being a non-Christian, approaching in here, getting in the ring, did Jesus claim to be God? Which is the very question. Did Jesus claim to be God? And David Wood, who do you think did better and why? And who, maybe both did good and both did bad, but tell me your reasons.
I think that Alex is just a lot more articulate than David Wood. He's just a lot sharper and a lot more, he's just a better rhetorician overall, and better speaker, and has more, his thoughts are really, really organized, and he's just super, I don't know. I just think he's very impressive. I think he's just the kind of person that could sell ice to an Eskimo. And I think even if his positions aren't very strong, his delivery is so spot on that his presentation was a lot smoother. I think he pressed David in the Q&A in ways that made David just kind of stutter.
We can discuss that if you like.
As far as the translation, totally fine with saying he was in the form of God and then made himself nothing.
It depends on how deep the form goes, but the key is that in verse 7, he takes on the form of a servant. So he starts out in a divine form and then descends into taking his human form.
Which I think is what David was getting at as well, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Excellent.
And it's not it's not a personal, I don't want to be insulting to him.
No, I get it.
I think he's also a smart guy. But I feel like he had a sort of hobby horse, or he had a he was like a one-trick pony in that debate. Like he really wanted to lean on the two powers in heaven thing, and that was all he had. He had the two powers in heaven. He had a curated list of examples in the Old Testament that I think were not great, and then he wanted to say that the Gospels are implying that Jesus is referring to this specific thing, even though nowhere in the New Testament do we find that specific thing. It has to be implied. So he was applying a hermeneutic. He had this sort of interpretive cipher that you need in order to support his argument. And I don't think Alex had that kind of cipher. I think he had just a straightforward interpretation of the text. I think David had a bigger sort of uphill battle to work through than Alex. I think Alex was able to coast on the plain reading of the text. I don't necessarily think that makes him right, because I don't think there is a right perspective, because I think we have 4 different gospels that have 4 different perspectives, and we have Paul. They brought Paul into it, and Paul is not supposed to be there, right?
That doesn't tell you what Jesus
said. Yeah.
there's so many.
So I think there was just a fundamental flaw in the premise of the debate, in the sort of things that were acceptable evidence in it. I don't think Paul was the right. I don't think they should have reached for Paul, and I think David should have diversified his sources and position a little bit better. But I also think he rightly pointed out that Alex did draw from a lot of late sources, and read them back into the New Testament, a little bit of Gnosticism here peppered in. But it was overall really fascinating and engaging, and it was probably like the highlight of that whole conference. Like, it was super. I mean, it was really interesting to see a crowd of probably 99.9% Christians giving a warm welcome to Alex, laughing at his jokes, and just being open-minded and just like, engaging and like, kudos to Ruslan for like hosting it, like arranging that on the heels of the cancellation, and the two of them like, talking bad about each other, and then getting them in the same room to host a debate. Like, I mean, he was amazing, and like he pulled off that conference spectacularly.
Wow. Well, I definitely look forward to the rest of the debate to watch myself. And I feel like might be helpful to look beyond just Jewish sources to explain the origin of the Trinity and how that makes sense. Plato may be somewhere we need to look at. Of course, we have other sources who talk about the logos and all sorts of stuff.
So hopefully people will get more accustomed to using Cross Bible to have 2 parallel translations side by side. By all means, use the NIV. I'm not knocking the NIV.
Yeah, but compare it.
But have it next to the NASB.
Because you're getting a lot of interpretation with every one of them's going to have interpretations.
Yeah.
But like, that's a pretty bold, just here's our interpretation of what.
I think everybody should be going back to the Greek, but not everybody has the time and the means to do so. I'm trying to facilitate that on Cross Bible with my Greek courses, and I teach Greek online. People can sign up and then, come learn Greek with me. But if you can't learn Greek, at least get those 2 translations side by side, and do not use an interlinear Bible. Do not use Young's literal translation. Like, those are not helpful.
Yeah.
You gotta, stick with like, I'm getting the NRSV. That's a very highly regarded scholarly translation, the updated edition. ESV is pretty good in my opinion as well. Obviously, there are a lot of theological and evangelical biases in some of these translations, but you kind of have to accept that and read past it.
Thank you, Stephen. Go to Cross Bible, check them out on the YouTube, check out the website, go support them. I really appreciate you, bro.
Thank you, Ben.